Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to A Child's Amaze, poem number 16 of the 29 of By the Roadside. Now, of course, we have seen the appearance of children already all the way through Leaves of Grass. We think, obviously, of Song of Myself 6. So here we're going to come back to it again. And I think, as I said in our previous lecture about farm picture, I think there's something really important going on here. These are little poems. I equated the New American Bible of Leaves of Grass in this section of By the Roadside to being maybe the Proverbs section. I think there's a lot more going on here than a lot of readers have given time or credence to. And I'm gonna try and play that one out here. Now, our assumptions are that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt. And you've been playing around with us and having these talks with these chats with Walt. From the very beginning of Inscriptions, I have given an introductory set of comments for intro to the By the Roadside. And of course, we just finished with Farm Picture. Let's go to Norton's for a moment to get a little bit of background information about Amaze. It was a drum taps poem. A drum taps, the section we're about to meet in a bit, of 1865. In 1867 annex. It was ungrouped in Leaves of Grass in 1871 and 76 and added to the present group finally in, of course, 1881. Now, I just want to remind you of some of the lines that we have already studied that are of some importance. Do you remember that in Song of Myself, passage 1, he will say, creeds and schools in abeyance? And that was that attack not only on education in schools, but also, of course, on the idea of formal religion. We're going to get to it. Do you remember in starting from Pomenock passage 1, he says, of earth, rocks, fifth month flowers experienced my amaze. And he loves this word amaze. We're going to see it in this poem. And then do you remember in Open Road, Song of the Open Road, passage 6, he says, now if 1,000 perfect men were to appear before me, it would not amaze me, the way he likes to use this word amaze. And you'll remember in Song of Myself 48, he asked it, why should I wish to see God better than this day? All of that will, I think, factor into our reading of this little brief three-line offering, A Child's Amaze. Silent and amazed, even when a little boy. I remember I heard the preacher every Sunday put God in his statements as contending against some being or influence. Now, there are readers of Leaves of Grass in the very beginning who were not so upset about just the obscenities, the sexual referencing, and the like. Of course, as we've said already, A Dalliance of the Eagles was one that obviously upset a lot of people, even though it's just a poem about the copulation of eagles. But there were a lot of people who said Leaves of Grass is dangerous because of its subversive nature, its iconoclastic nature, to especially the institution of religion. And of course, here we are going to play the game out. Now notice the genius of what Whitman does. He says that from a very young age, there was something I understood. I saw it as a child. Notice the first word is the word silent and amazed. Notice here, silent takes us back to learned astronomer, that there are times when silence is a profound element of Whitman's pedagogy. Some of the most important learning happens in the silence. We think, of course, of Mozart saying that the music is not in the notes, but the space between the notes. The power of the silence, right? And as he says it, amazed, silent and amazed. Even is a key word here. In other words, I figured this out at a very young age, the poet will say, when a little boy. And of course, that takes us to Song of Myself, passage 6, where a child's going to walk up to him and say, dude, what is this grass stuff? And he says, how can I answer the child? I didn't know any better. Now, again, the ironies of Leaves of Grass are always compounding. He says, even as a little boy, I remember. Think about the power of remembrance in Leaves of Grass. It is constant. It is an ongoing kind of propedeutic for us. That we are so much the stories that we tell and retell, the stories that we decide to accept or reject. But it's the remembering of those stories, and he's kind of musing. You can tell this, again, this is this musing section, right? Amuse, A Child's Amaze. I remember I heard the preacher, and you'll remember in Song of Myself, passage 33, that he played that game of the sweating Methodist preacher, right? I heard the preacher, the key word is every Sunday. And we've said already in some of our biographic information how influenced the Quaker religion was on Whitman, no question. I mean, he breathed the air, the religious air of his day. But here, notice, even as a child, he will remind us that he heard the preacher every Sunday that's a key word, right? Put God in his statements. Now, there are some who have read this as put God in his place. But notice here, put God in his statements. That is to say, in the way that the preacher was preaching, he would put God in his statements. The word as comes next, and it could be read as kind of simile, but it's really as if, right? As contending against some being or influence. Now, this is an interesting little poem, and again, notice it kind of takes us back to Whitman's influence of Hegel on him. This idea of having the opposites, having the this or that, the thesis, antithesis, with the potentiality of a synthesis. I think for Whitman, he saw Leaves of Grass as the great synthesis. I've called it a sustained theodicy, the last of our big five. Why is it that there must be pain and suffering in the world and all of that? Notice here what he's saying is, I remember hearing the preacher preach, and he placed God in every statement that he made as if he was contending against some being or influence. Now, how you read this word contending will have everything to do with this poem. Some will read this as Whitman is congratulating whatever preacher it was that was teaching him that great religion is all about wrestling with Jacob, for those of you that know your biblical text. In other words, great religion is all about contending with God, back and forth, the great Hebraic tradition of God is always looking for somebody to have a conversation with, and if not even better than that, a debate with. We think, of course, of how many stories in the Hebrew Bible will play that game out. Is that what contending here means? Or is rather Whitman being ironic? That is to say, the preacher thought that he understood God and he could translate God, but in fact he had no idea what was going on at all, and that to that degree, even as a child, I understood something this preacher could not have understood. Namely, of course, that there is something beyond the idea of God that is normally presented in the church hall or in the auditorium, very much akin to the way in which he could hear the learned astronomer teaching about the stars, but he had to get up because he was kind of tired of it all, and he had to go outside and actually experience, in that case, the stars for himself. Well, how do you read this at 2a? Many have said this, that this is Whitman's understanding that true religion is something profoundly spiritual, something far more than sitting in a pew and listening to a preacher go on. We'll get to him that was crucified later to get to Whitman's actual theology as he presented it, at least in part in Leaves of Grass. I think word choice here is compelling. His use of the word put, his use of the word against, his use of the word contending, all of those words give rise to the potentiality that maybe Whitman is critiquing a certain kind of orthodoxy that thinks that it can talk about God without actually understanding God. I just want to take us at 3a to Nietzsche's classic passage of the man-mad passage, God is dead. Notice in that passage he says, and we have killed him, and what will we do now? I've given a full lecture on this passage at learnstrong.net that I would direct you to. Finally, at 3b, to own a little poem like this, where do you come down in this dialectic, if I could use the Hegelian term, because Whitman would have liked that we were using that term now, the dialectic maybe between talking about God and talking with God. That is to say, the distinction between the religious and the spiritual, and how do you kind of come down on that? And is it possible that those are actually not somehow necessarily opposed forces at all? And what do you make of that very last word of this poem? Again, just the brilliance of it, the word influence. And to what degree do you feel like you are being influenced in your study of Leaves of Grass? I hope that it's positive. Thank you.